So, taking product photos. You don't have to have a fancy camera in order to take good product photos, especially these days. Our phones have amazing cameras on them, generally speaking, so you can absolutely take your product photos with your phone. Today, I want to go over a few tips for you as to how to make that better. In other words, how to take better photos with your phone, some of the tips and tricks that you can use in order to improve those photos so that they look closer to what you're going to get with a mirrorless or DSLR professional camera. So the first thing, and this goes without saying, although I have said it many times, and I talked about this in my recent video where I gave you 10 tips on generally how to improve your product photos. I'll link to that. I'll put a card up here. Today specifically is about using your phone. So good lighting is the number one thing you can do. Make sure you have good lighting. Some phones won't be able to cope with lower light conditions like a camera could because you can adjust for it a little bit more, although I am going to go into the detail of how you can use your camera settings on your phone to hopefully improve this. But just make sure you have good, bright, natural daylight light. That's number one. So the second thing I think is really important, and I remember when I learned this tip, I just saw it somewhere, I can't remember where, and I was like, oh my God, that's so obvious, but I've never thought about it before. And that is to clean your camera lens. Like, we are holding our phones all the time. We're getting our little grubby fingerprints all over every part of our phones. So you need to make sure that before you start taking photos with your phone, you clean the lens properly so there's no smudging. How often have you taken a cool photo, maybe not a product photo, but just some other sort of photo, and then you're like, oh, well, that looks a bit crap because I have a smudge all over my lens, and so it, messes with the photo. So make sure to always clean your lens before you start taking photos with your phone. The third thing is, if possible, find the expert mode on your camera. So my phone has an expert mode. It depends on what phone you have. So I'm not giving specific Android or Apple advice today. I'm just giving you some general things to look for. So find some sort of expert mode. And if you can't do that, maybe download a camera app from the App Store or Google Play that you can actually adjust this stuff on, because it's going to make it easier to adjust for numerous things in the environment, just like you would if you were using a regular camera. So look for the following settings if you have them to adjust. The first one is the ISO or the ISO. This is the sensitivity of the camera. So what you'll notice if you take a photo with a low ISO, which if you have a brightly lit environment, you should be able to do, you'll get a nice, crisp, clear image. But if you're in a low light situation, you have to increase the ISO. And what that will do is it'll add a grainy texture to the image that you just cannot get rid of. So you want to make sure, that's why having such bright light is important, because you can have a lower ISO and this will enable you to take much crisper, cleaner, clearer images, avoiding that noise or that fuzziness on the image that you might have noticed in previous images that you've taken. So the next thing is the aperture, which is the size of the lens so how much light it's letting in. Now, if you go to, it's a bit counterintuitive because this is also called the f-stop. If you go to a low number, that's actually a wider opening, so it lets in more light, and it also decreases the depth of field. So where you get that look where you have the photo or the person in focus and then the background goes all blurry. That's a low f-stop or, a really open aperture. But then when you shut it down, you get more of the image in focus. Okay, so you might want to play with that. You may want to make sure that only your product is in focus and the background is blurry. So that could be a way that you could affect this, especially if you have a normal camera, if you can't affect the aperture on your phone. I'm going to talk about another tricksy way of doing that in a minute that you may be able to use instead. So the next thing is the shutter speed. If you can adjust the shutter speed. So this is obviously how quickly the photo, shutter closes and opens. And the faster that happens, the quicker it'll take the image and the less light it will let in. And the longer the shutter speed, so the slower the shutter speed, the more light it will let in. So, if you've seen those photos of the night sky where it's like you got the stars are like smeared together. That's because the shutter's been left open for ages. So it's been able to follow all that light and let all that light in. Generally speaking, you want to have, just a normal mid-range shutter speed, but you can play around with this. Maybe you need a slightly slower shutter speed to let in a little bit more light, or you want a slightly faster shutter speed. If we're taking action shots, you want a really fast shutter speed to get a nice, crisp, clear shot, but you're taking product photo shots. So it doesn't really matter, except to the point that if your shutter speed's too slow and you are holding your phone, that can cause blur, right? Because the possibility of you shaking while it's taking the picture. So make sure the shutter speed is not too long or slow, because you want to reduce that blur or the camera shake if you're freehanding your photos. Ideally, if you're taking your photos on a tripod, that won't be so much of an issue. The next thing is your white balance. So you want to make sure that your white balance is set to natural light. Usually I find just doing it via auto setting for me is usually the best. The camera's pretty good at picking this up, but sometimes in some circumstances it won't be. Now this is something you can fix somewhat in post-production. So when you're editing, you should always edit. In my membership community for makers, the Thriver Circle, I'm actually doing a workshop taking you through the basics of product photography editing. So if you want to check that out, I'll put a link to the Thriver Circle below and you can go take that workshop if you'd like to. So editing, you can fix the white balance, but it's obviously best to get it as good as you can from the start so that you don't have to mess around. And you want to make sure those colors are as true to life as possible, because that's going to make a big difference in keeping your customers happy, because your photos are going to be more true to life. On your phone, you may also have an exposure or brightness or something setting like that. Usually I think it's exposure. Now on a normal camera, the exposure is controlled by a combination of the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed. You can perhaps affect this somewhat, like I said, by changing the shutter speed or the ISO settings on your phone. But there's also possibly this setting. So just play around with that again. You want your photos to be bright, but not too bright. It's really important to avoid overexposing. I think this is something that's really easy to do for people, especially in the beginning, because you're like, it needs to be bright, it needs to be light. Yes, it does. But if you overexpose and go too far, it just starts looking unnatural, and that's what you want to avoid. Okay, so the trick I was talking about before, where I was saying, you may not have an aperture setting, so you might not be able to affect the depth of field. A lot of phones have something called a portrait mode, and what that does is it creates that depth effect. So it makes it so that the subject of the image is in focus and everything else has that lovely blurred bokeh effect in the background. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of the photos I've taken where I've just taken it with the normal camera, and then where I've taken it with the portrait mode, and you'll see the difference between the two. You'll see how the background is much more blurred in the portrait mode, and this can be really nice if you are taking a photo that has a background to it and that you want to blur out, that you really want your product to stand out and pop in the image. So play around with this portrait mode and it might actually end up working really nicely for you, especially if you are taking like the model shots or group shots or something like that. I talk about all the different types of product photos you should be taking in another video I've done, the 7 types of product photos you should be taking. Again, I'll put a card to that and I'll link to it below. So portrait mode, very fun thing to do. I'm almost positive that all iPhones have this. I looked this up before the video and it said that you guys have a portrait mode setting. I know my Oppo phone has this portrait mode built in. I used to have a Samsung. I can't remember if that's got that built in, but I think it probably does. Anyway, it might be called something else, but basically have a go with that. It's a nice effect. You probably don't want that for all your product photos because it might blur out important parts of the product at times, but to have that for some of your photos just gives it a nice feeling, a nice sort of macro-esque type of feeling to the photos, which can be especially nice if you are photographing small things. And of course, finally, the last thing you need to do is edit your photos. On my phone, if I'm editing, I'll use Snapseed usually. There's a whole bunch of other ones, things like Lightroom. On my desktop, there's, Affinity, Photoshop, GIMP. Honestly, I just tend to use the inbuilt photo editor on Windows 10 because it does pretty much everything I need to do. And if there's something that it doesn't do that I need to do, then I take the image and put it in another program and do the last little tweaks that I need. But seriously, always edit your photos that you've taken. And if you're doing it all on your phone, find a good app and learn how to use it. I do recommend that you strongly consider editing on your desktop, because you can see detail on the desktop that you can't necessarily see on this tiny screen. And while most people do shop on their devices these days, some people do still shop on their desktops. And if you've done the whole shebang on your phone and you haven't looked at your photos enlarged on a desktop, and there's like hair on there or dust or something and you've missed it, then that's going to turn some people off. So make sure, even if you initially edit on your phone, take your photos and edit on your phone, make sure to at least look at your photos afterwards on a larger screen. So it may be a tablet or a laptop or a desktop, and make sure that you haven't missed anything important. And it's always a good idea to look at your photos on multiple devices and multiple screens, just to get a feel for how that editing looks on different screens. Like sometimes I'll edit something on my desktop and then I'll think it's perfect and it's bright enough, and then I'll bring it over to my phone and look and I'm like, no, that is not bright enough. The product doesn't stand out as much. It looks different on the phone. So you have to play around and make sure that you're getting as good and true to life image as possible on as many devices as possible, so that your product photos are crisp, clear, and true to life. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back again soon with another video. My name is Jess Van Den. Please do consider subscribing to my channel if you are interested in videos about handmade business, happiness, and health, and all the other stuff I talk about here. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.